I've always been drawn to the wild and being outside. As a kid, I always wanted to be in the woods behind my house. The older I got, the more time I spent out there exploring. Now, at the age of 30, I can pretty much say that I've spent half of my life in the wild. It's not unusual for me to pack up a few things and head out for a few days at a time without much more than a sleeping bag, a fishing pole, and a knife. I don't need much to feel at home in the woods. I'm happy to just curl up next to a log, start a small fire, and call it a night. I've done that since I was old enough to get away with it without my mom having a fit. My nickname was Mowgli as a kid, 'cause you'd think I was raised by wolves. Anyway, last summer I went on a trip to my buddy's cabin in northern Michigan. There were about 6 of us who went up there. I decided to take a hike down a deer trail to this area I wanted to explore. I wanted to stay the night there and check it out in the morning. I was a couple of miles out when a storm set in. It had already started getting dark, so with the storm it was too dark to see much. At that point, I figured that the quickest shelter would be these caves I knew about maybe a half mile from where I was. It was already almost 9 p.m. when I made the decision to head there. I took the turn off the trail that led to the caves and started to make my way down. But while I was walking, I got the feeling that I was being followed. It was a strange feeling that just came over me all of a sudden. I decided to take my .357 out of my holster, just in case I needed to defend myself. I kept on the trail to the caves and hoped I wasn't being stalked. But I got there just fine and settled in for the night. I must have dozed off because before I knew it, several hours had passed and I was dreaming that someone was yelling at me to wake up. I was disoriented and not sure if it was part of my dream or if someone was actually trying to wake me up. I realized I was drenched in sweat and feeling uneasy. I grabbed my gun and flashlight and shone the light around outside. I couldn't make out anything in the darkness, but I thought I could hear something moving around not that far away. I was thinking it might be wolves. I decided I just wanted to get out of there since the storm was gone. I knew a back way out of the caves and I figured I would cut through the woods and get back to camp. I was on high alert, listening for any sign of anything approaching me. Regardless of me trying to stay focused, I got turned around at some point because after a bit, I found myself back near the caves again. I could see the entrance, but here's where it got bizarre. I saw a figure near the entrance that appeared to be something wolf-like, but was about 3 times the size of your average wolf. Not to mention it was standing upright. From what I could see, it had a real unnatural, bulky build. The shoulders on that thing were so wide and its back seemed humped. I couldn't see its face very well, but it had its snout up in the air like maybe it was smelling the air. I was afraid that it had caught a scent of me. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I watched it moving its head back and forth, and I could swear I could hear it growling deep in its throat. I stayed quiet and managed to get on the right trail and headed in the right direction out of there. When I reached the trail crossing where I had picked up the deer track, I heard a howl unlike anything I've ever heard. It didn't sound like a wolf. It was terrifying. I felt like I had gotten away from the caves just in time. I was sure if that thing had seen me, I would have been in serious danger. I made it back to camp, and next morning when I told everybody what I saw, nobody believed me and were laughing that the famous Mowgli got scared out of the woods. So I said, fine, we'll all go to the caves and look for the tracks. So after breakfast, we headed over there. We all had our rifles, so I felt okay about going back. When we got near the mouth of the cave, I made everybody stand back so if there were prints, they wouldn't be accidentally disturbed. My friend Nick was a pretty experienced tracker in our group, so he went and looked. He almost immediately had a shocked reaction. He waved us forward and there were unmistakable tracks. The ground was still damp from the last night's rain. It was crazy. It was hard to miss what looked like 6-inch wide dog tracks. And the length was like 1.5 times my shoe. Wolves and coyotes have nowhere near that big of paws. The tracks were all around the outside of the cave but didn't seem to go in. The cave entrance was really narrow, so I don't know if that creature would even have fit through. Well, no one was laughing then. Nick said he had no desire to try to follow tracks like that and would rather not know who they belonged to. We all felt the same way. We all just wanted to get out of there. We went back to the cabin and didn't venture far from it for the rest of the trip. I had been around those caves before and never came across anything but local wildlife. So I don't know if that thing was new to those woods, and if so, what had drawn it there? Last year, I was working in a warehouse that my dad bought in Pennsylvania. It was in a remote location with no neighbors within a half-mile, and all you could see around there were cornfields. My dad got it for about half of what it was worth. The guy who was getting rid of it seemed really stoked when my dad signed the papers, which probably should have been a warning. The warehouse was huge, but the remote location had its drawbacks. One of the biggest challenges was the lack of cell service in the area, which made it hard to coordinate with suppliers or customers. Anyway, we made it work with a landline. I usually worked alone. My main job was to restore the front office area so it could be more efficient and functional. In order to reach the front office, you had to pass through a hallway connecting the main warehouse to another office space, and then proceed through yet another door to get to the front. From the first day I started working there, Elle was always hearing these weird thumps and banging noises. But the thing that always made me feel especially weird was that the door locks were backwards. It was like they were designed to keep something confined inside the building rather than keeping people out. I was in the front office one day when I started to hear the loudest thumping I had heard so far. At first, I tried to ignore it and kept putting painter's tape around the door in front of me. But when I heard a screeching sound on top of the thumping, I couldn't ignore it anymore. My heart started racing and I was wishing that I could just have one day of freaking peace to do my work in. I couldn't imagine what it could be. I assumed it had to an animal of some sort that had found its way inside. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing to worry about. But my nervousness only got worse when I heard the violent slam of the secondary office door. I peeked around the corner and saw that the door was closed. Even though I knew there was no draft strong enough to make the door close so violently, I tried to pretend that's what happened. But I knew something strange was happening. I couldn't shake the feeling of creepiness that had settled in my gut, and I knew I needed to investigate to figure out what was going on. The thumping noise got closer and my heart was really pounding. I couldn't tell how close the noise was, but it sounded like it was right on the other side of the door. I couldn't move. My eyes were focused on the door handle, and I watched it slowly start to turn. The door opened, and I could feel myself just wanting to run. The door swung wider and wider until it was fully open. But there was nothing there. No visible movement, no air movement, just creepy silence. The silence was that deafening kind that you can actually hear. It was like the quiet had a presence of its own, and it was suffocating me. Then there was this ungodly screech. It totally sounded human, and it sounded like it was coming from the main warehouse. The pain and anger in that scream was just chilling. Without thinking, I turned and ran out of the front office. I needed to get as far away as possible from whatever was happening in the warehouse. I got in my car and drove until I had cell service to call my dad. Even though he sounded skeptical about all the door-closing weirdness, he did acknowledge that something strange was going on with the building. He said he would come and check it out, and we agreed to meet up at the site. About half an hour later, my dad and I arrived at the warehouse. I showed him the door that had slammed shut earlier, pointing out how it was separate from both the front office and the main warehouse. It was clear that no draft could have made it close. I reminded him that there was no logical reason for all the thumping noises and the screeching noises that had been going on. He agreed to investigate the main warehouse with me. With my dad by my side, I felt brave enough to lead the way into the warehouse. The building used to be a furniture manufacturing facility, and they made handcrafted tables, chairs, and other furniture items, which meant that the floor had a thick coat of dust on it. We stepped inside the warehouse and nothing seemed out of place. The dust on the floor wasn't disturbed, the doors were closed, and the windows were all locked. The only thing that caught our attention was one of the fluorescent light fixtures was hanging down and swaying a little. My dad got a ladder and held it steady while I climbed up to inspect the light. As I looked on top of the light, I saw something that just gave me chills. It was a large, fresh human handprint. There were no footprints in the dust around the light, nothing at all. I climbed down and switched places with my dad. He saw it and said, "That's not possible. There's been no one in here for months." And then, like it wanted to make its presence known, the thumping noise returned. But this time it was different. It felt like an earthquake shaking the whole building. That was followed up by that horrible screech. It felt like it was coming right out of the walls. We ran out of there and I have not returned to that building since. My dad had to hire someone else to finish my work. The new employee reported hearing the thumping noise, but so far, no other strange events have occurred. I might never know what actually happened there, but there's no doubt in my mind that there's a paranormal presence in that building, and the previous owner was fully aware of it. The memory of the sound of that lock turning on its own, and the feeling of being surrounded by that oppressive presence will stay with me forever. This was a couple years ago when I had gone to hang out at my best friend's house. We lived in a small town in northern Wisconsin. My friend had just started driving, but her mom had already grounded her from her car for not following some rule. So we were really bored and there wasn't anything we felt like doing, so we decided to walk to the small downtown area. The walk there was pretty long. We had to cross some dirt roads and follow a railroad track. By the time we got there, it was getting dark. It was the weekend and we thought we might run into someone we knew. We poked around a couple of the shops, but there was nothing interesting, so we went over to the little park. You know how it is when you're a teenager and everything just seems boring. We were swinging on the swings and I spotted 2 sheriff police cars parked at the end of the downtown strip near this old mechanic shop. My friend thought they were probably searching for 2 guys who had been breaking into cars around town. We decided to start heading back since it was almost like 10 p.m. at that point and I wasn't looking forward to the long walk back through the fields and railroad tracks in the dark. So we were walking past the mechanic's place, about to turn the corner, and I heard a helicopter. My friend thought it was a police helicopter looking for the car hoppers. I highly doubted they would go so far as to use a helicopter for a petty crime. But I started to feel worried that the police might mistake us for the car hoppers they were looking for. We were walking across the street from the sheriff cars and I tried not to act suspicious even though we hadn't done anything wrong. We rounded the corner and we came to the huge grassy field behind the downtown strip. At the end of the field, there are these dense woods, and it was at the boundary of the field and the woods that we saw something bizarre. It was like a massive rod-like object that was hanging there in midair. It was hovering just above the tree line. It's kind of hard to describe it accurately, but it was like 2 rods stacked on top of each other, with the upper one slightly extending to the right and the lower one to the left. Both ends had these green lights that were glowing and pulsing. Maybe it was because it was so dark, but the glowing seemed like it spread over a really large area. The object was enormous, and its shape seemed incompatible for an airborne object. I was completely bewildered by the scene in front of me. I could still hear the sound of a helicopter, but I didn't see any sign of one. Instead, I found myself staring at this impossible object suspended in midair. My friend, who I knew wasn't really a believer in UFOs or aliens, was still insisting that it was some kind of police aircraft looking for the car hoppers, which in my mind sounded more gullible than believing in UFOs, for God's sake. I mean, if we had aircraft like that, I'm pretty sure it would be top secret and not hanging out in a field. It was definitely not a plane. Its shape was just a rod, without wings or propellers. The fact that it was so huge and was able to stay suspended in midair was inexplicable, and it was positioned at an odd angle. I remember the next part clearly. I lifted my phone up to take a picture, and the object suddenly started spinning toward us. It was totally surreal. It spun really fast, like it was a propeller itself. You could hear the sound of the wind as it was cutting through the air. I was completely stunned. My mind was struggling to make sense of what was happening. It was like the object was responding to my phone. My friend started panicking and pushed my hands down. Then the spinning motion immediately stopped, and the object began to reposition itself, lifting up a little and started to move toward downtown. I have to tell you, the helicopter sound hadn't been coming from the object. The helicopter we heard had appeared in front of the rod-shaped object, almost like it was escorting it away. The helicopter didn't look like a conventional one, though. Maybe it was because I was on the verge of hysteria, but it seemed to have a distorted shape and its windows were unusually large. The lights were on inside it, which I thought was really weird for a helicopter flying around in the dark. I can't emphasize enough how unsettling the whole situation was. The object and the helicopter were hovering right above us, and it felt like we were in the middle of something that could be catastrophic. The sound of the helicopter blades was deafening, and the size of the object was mind-boggling. My friend kept trying to rationalize it as some sort of police aircraft, but I knew deep down that it was not of this world. The way it moved, the lights, the sound, everything about it was just so strange and otherworldly. When you see something that doesn't fit into any category, it's like your brain just can't process it. My brain didn't know what to do with this information, and it was incredibly unnerving. It was like everything I thought I knew about the world was being questioned. But all we could do after all that was to just walk away. I looked back a few times, but then we both just wanted to get home as quickly as possible. It's strange to think that I used to think a close encounter would be cool. But after that experience, I don't ever want to go through something like that again.